what have you been seeing in terms of the growth in podcast advertising? And again, I want to not just, make it more sort of generic across the African markets, but look at some of the specifics in all the three markets, if we can, because that I'm finding that to be interesting, because again, it's not as, call it, generic in some instances as radio, for instance, is. Like, you have a handful of really big radio stations that serve a certain kind of content, but with podcasts, there's a bit of a long tail. So what have you been seeing in terms of, I suppose, the growth coming out of COVID and looking ahead to 2027 in terms of the growth in sort of the various markets?
Yeah, so first of all, podcast advertising and the growth that we've seen, right? So in South Africa in 2022, it was up 16.4% relative to 2021, right? And part of the growth that we've seen within the podcast advertising is podcasts generally have very sticky listeners, right? If we think about radio, you'll have it in the background, and yes, it's certainly part of your day and you've got it in the car, whatever, but you'll engage and disengage with it obviously quite frequently throughout the day. Yeah. Generally, when somebody wants to, tune in to Mongezi's, the Lead Creative podcast, they've tuned in because they've made a conscious decision that they like what you talk about and they want to listen.
And you've just created our ad, just by the way.
There we go. But they're sticky listeners because you've actually gone and accessed that particular piece of content, right? And I think the stat, and you may know this better than me as well, but podcast listeners, more than 80%, right? Around 80% listen to the entire podcast, right? So that's real engagement, right? In terms of users, and that's something which is certainly continuing to drive the advertising revenue. And as I say, there's growth, but it's still has a lot of critical mass. But sure, it fits in as well very strongly with the access versus ownership,